Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent putting a few things into motion, like investigating money services businesses in Minnesota and announcing an upcoming IRS fraud task force. The department is also targeting money laundering. To discuss Minnesota fraud, the ICE shooting in Portland, and the protests in Iran, joining us is Gerard Filitti, senior counsel at the Lawfare Project, political strategist and Middle East affairs analyst. Gerard, good afternoon. I just want to start off by asking you this. What do you think is at the root of this problem, that there's this level of fraud in Minnesota?
Well, I think the level of this fraud is unprecedented, and one of the reasons why it's this large is it simply has not been examined. This is something that's happened within a more isolated community, using different communications methods, using different tactics to send money, to funnel money out of the state system. So this has not been so easy to catch. And as we've seen from a lot of investigative reporting, they actually do set up some sort of business. There actually is some sort of physical presence for some of these operations that your viewers are seeing on the screen right now. So that makes it more difficult for fraud to be detected, because it's not just a PO box, there's a physical presence and people who are there receiving the checks.
Vice President Vance yesterday announced the creation of a new assistant attorney general position, to help investigate billions of dollars in fraud affecting the federal government. How much of an impact do you think this will have?
I think it will have a huge impact. Up until this point, fraud has been treated as a one-off. We've had task forces over the years that have looked at different aspects of fraud and abuse. We've seen fraud and abuse come up in the context of Doge as well at the beginning of President Trump's second term. But now having an assistant attorney general dedicated to this shows that the government is committing resources to address this as a systemic problem. This is a whole of the government approach that will be more efficient going forward in detecting and prosecuting these cases so that we see less of it. So this is not just a one-off task force to address one problem. This is being set up as a way to address a systemic problem of fraud that's affecting many parts of the government.
Okay, Gerard, now about the protests. Just yesterday, 2 people were shot by an immigration agent in Portland. DHS says they are illegal aliens connected to Tren de Aragua. So can you tell us more about Tren de Aragua members and the kind of risks U.S. agents are working under to capture them?
Well, Tren de Aragua is identified and labeled as a terrorist group, as a narco-terrorist organization. So this is a level of federal designation that speaks to their dangerousness. This is not just a gang. This is not just drug dealers or thugs. This is organized crime that's directed by foreign interests. So the members of this organization, the members are really narco-terrorists who pose a significant danger to national security, to civilians, and to law enforcement. We're not talking about drug dealers. We're talking about people who have guns, people who are armed, and people who are here to do significant damage. So when we have these law enforcement encounters, unfortunately, these are not people who are just here illegally. These are people who are here committing crime.
So FBI Director Kash Patel said the Bureau is investigating anti-immigration enforcement protests, and the review includes organizers, protesters, funding sources. He said those campaigns may be driving illicit activities. Do you see any patterns when it comes to the tactics that are being used by protest groups?
We're absolutely seeing patterns. We're seeing very aggressive protesters. What we're not seeing are peaceful demonstrations where people are marching to a public square to be heard. These are protesters who are actually physically encountering law enforcement officers, trying to block their cars, trying to prevent them physically from gaining access to buildings or to perform their law enforcement functions. And this is organized. This is not just in one occasion or one location. We have people who are designating themselves as observers or as leaders who are there to identify the law enforcement personnel and publish their location, to track how they're operating. This is highly sophisticated and not just something done by random people who are dissatisfied with a government policy. So this level of organization is funded and it's directed. And what the government is saying now is that it needs to find out who is organizing this to start cracking down so that we don't have these violent confrontations that lead to tragedy.
Okay, you said these protests largely are not peaceful. So when do protests become an impediment to law enforcement operations and endanger public safety?
They become an impediment the moment you go from peacefully saying what you want to grabbing police officers, throwing rocks, throwing firebombs, targeting officers with violence, getting in their way to prevent them from leaving or preventing them from entering something. That's no longer a peaceful First Amendment verbal protest. That's conduct. That becomes conduct that's illegal. So you're allowed in this country to say that you don't want police in your neighborhood or you don't want ICE in your neighborhood, but you cannot block their cars or try to push them away from buildings, because that becomes a crime. That's the conduct that becomes a crime. And unfortunately, what we're seeing and what we're seeing more often is that we're not just seeing peaceful protesters like you see on your screen, people holding signs, but we're seeing people engaged in physically confronting law enforcement. And that's dangerous. It leads to escalations where violence has occurred and people have lost their lives.
Now, Gerard, about the protests in Iran, what is the significance of these protests? Is what's happening now different?
These are perhaps the most significant protests we have seen in Iran in the last 46 years of the Ayatollah's regime that have the potential for actually bringing down the current government. Unlike previous protests, which were targeted by students or by people who are dissatisfied with a specific government policy, we see people now mobilizing on the streets from all walks of life: merchants, professors, teachers, students, pensioners. Everyone is gathering on the streets to protest the conditions that the government has resulted in Iranian economy, in Iranian people suffering under this regime. And what we're seeing now is not a demand for a structural change. We're seeing a demand targeting that the entire government go. So this is the most significant set of protests that we've seen in the last 46 years.
Okay, just finally, what do you make of President Trump's threat of involvement if the Iranian regime kills any protesters? And this is, of course, against the backdrop of what the administration just did in Venezuela.
I think it's a very powerful threat that's reverberating strongly within the Iranian government. I think that President Trump is looking to sustain and to uphold human rights values in Iran. So the message is to the Ayatollah regime, to the Islamist Republic, to not use violence against the people, the civilians, to keep the soldiers, their enforcement mechanism, their secret police on their base. I think President Trump is likely, if anything, to strike military targets if he sees tanks rolling to suppress the people. If he sees the military being used to target civilians, President Trump may order directed strikes against these military facilities, not boots on the ground, not involvement in Iran, but eliminating assets that the regime is using to oppress people. And that would be a very powerful incentive for the people of Iran to finally get their freedom.
Okay, Gerard, very insightful comments today. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.